Are you going to record it? Okay, you got it. Got it going. Thank you.
Why?
All right. So good morning to everyone. Good evening to our Indian colleagues that may be joining. Welcome to a snowy last day of February here in Pullman. And I'm Dr. Noel Schultz, and I am co-director of the Advanced Grid Institute. And my colleague, Jeff Daigle, the PNNL co-director, is also on. And we're excited to continue to partner with ESIC to provide once a month a seminar where we talk about AGI related topics and there's a lot of overlap. And so we appreciate everyone that's here. And, as we talk about energy, there's a lot of different activities that are overlapping. And as we talk about climate change, as we talk about water. And so today we're going to have a great discussion on that. And so first I would like to introduce our speaker, Nathalie Voisin. And she is, Dr. Voisin is a chief scientist for the regional Water Energy Dynamics in the Earth Systems Predictability and Resilience Group at PNNL, where she leads multi-institutional water and energy projects valued at millions of dollars. Her research focuses on advancements of hydrometeorological forecasting and coupling of human Earth system models to unlock new understanding around critical energy and water systems. She also holds a dual appointment, associate professor at the University of Washington in the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department. And she holds her PhD from the University of Washington in Civil Engineering and a master's degree from McGill University in Canada with an undergraduate degree from France. So, so we're looking forward to this talk on pathways to net zero in the Western US, considering the impacts of climate change, resilience to climate extremes, and equity. So Dr. Voisin, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. So my name is Nathalie Voisin, and it's a pleasure to present on this work on the behalf of the entire GODEEEP team that I'm going to talk about today. Let me provide a bit of background. Okay, sorry, it's a bit slow to change. So we're talking about climate change, and we do know that limiting the global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius requires achieving global net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And the electricity sector is a bit at the center of this because it accounts for 40% of global greenhouse gas emission. But other sectors like the industry and transport need to electrify to achieve that low carbon economy. And that puts more stress on the electricity sectors. So when we talk about getting net zero, there is a lot of effort on the electricity sector. But we want to mention here in this talk that this is part of a bigger effort. With this bigger effort, it means that we need to address and we need to adopt a holistic approach to net zero. In our view, achieving net zero emission is going to be addressed by having decarbonization pathways. The decarbonization pathways, it's for the whole economy, not just the electricity sectors. And what we are hearing from the industry, for example, is that a couple of things need to happen across sectors, and the timing is very important. Some things need to be ready before the next things can happen. So decarbonization pathways really needs to account for the entire economy to understand that critical timing. As part of this pie, so there's the economics and decarbonization pathways. We are talking a lot about engineering solutions to have that decarbonization of the electricity sectors. So if you go down on this angle, we're talking about resilience and reliability. We're decarbonizing, but we need to still provide the services. And what we're thinking here is that all of those new engineering solutions are very often climate dependent. And we need to understand and we need to use more environmental intelligence to have the right operations and the right infrastructure, not overbuilt, operate smartly, but having all of the resilience that is required and in a way that foster domestic and international collaboration. Decarbonization, again, it's a game changer. And this is not just the economy, it's also the people. So we see a lot of emerging science on the social side. It's about justice and equity. So we have also, we want to spend more time on understanding the environmental and social equity impacts of decarbonizing, of the decarbonizations across sectors. And once we have all of those pathways, the engineering solutions, and understanding all of the intended consequences, then there is the adoption piece. The adoption piece, that's what you have here on the left, is really accelerating progress. It's not being done by just one industry or one sector, it's by the entire community. So what we're trying to do with our initiative and our work is to make sure that we have the transfer of methods, tools, and data sets, and that we have end use cases to empower the entire industry and the stakeholders at large to perform their own assessments. And then all of the system can co-evolve and we can achieve our goals. So this is what I'm presenting today, is really that the GODEEEP initiative. GODEEEP stands for Grid Operations, Decarbonizations, Environmental and Energy Equity Platform. This is an internal initiative that started last year and is going to last for another year. It's $4 million, and we have those 4 pillars that correspond to that holistic perspective, that holistic approach to net zero. I already talked a little bit about the decarbonization pathways, where we're putting a lot of emphasis on that multi-sectoral piece and that timing of the different sectors, but also the importance of having a diversity in pathways and the international interactions. We're not the only one decarbonizing. So we need to understand what's happening in our neighbors and in the neighboring markets. The second pillar of our initiative is resilience and reliability. We're evaluating all of the decarbonization pathways from an economics and reliability perspective, but also with a focus on the environmental intelligence, with understanding the energy droughts, which help us inform infrastructure and operation design. We also have an emphasis on creating extreme events to do stress tests. And then again, all of this is really allowing us to review all of the data sets that exist and really get back to all of our partner agency on the environmental side to say what are the products that we need to achieve net zero. We do have a pillar on justice and equity. We are talking about environmental and social equity impacts on decarbonizations, where we're doing social economic projections and of demographic characteristics. I don't know if you see, okay, good to know. I think the very bottom is a little bit cut. But also the impact from census block to state scales. This is going to be worth an entire other talk. So I'm going to focus on 1, 2, and the last piece is accelerated progress, how we're ensuring that the community can see what we see. It's not just a report, it's also all of the tools that people can use, and we can bring all of the community with us in achieving the net zero. And for this, we are using reproducible workflows, open source tools and data sets, but also proprietary one. Everything that is non-proprietary, we're going to put it on GODEEEP.pnl.gov. It's coming soon, but it's going to be a good place to start and really have access to all of the data sets you need. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that. So with this in mind, we are a big team. We have a lot of people working on this initiative. So we have our different pillars. And just to notice that for the advanced progress, we have a lead, but all of the different pillars really all contributes to the advanced progress and developing those tools. What we have, so myself, Natalie Voisin, I'm a co-PI of the GODEEEP initiative, and I'm joined by Stephanie Waldorf, just making sure acknowledge the leadership here with also all of the people who are involved are part of the leadership. But really thanks everyone from the team. It's a big team and very interdisciplinary as well. So here's what we've been working on, following our 4 pillars. First, the decarbonization pathways. What you have here just on the left are actually the federal goals. Net zero is a game changer, And the federal goals are to achieve 50% reduction in economy-wide greenhouse gas by 2030 and net zero greenhouse gas emission by 2050. And all states will achieve a clean grid by 2035. How do we get decarbonization pathways? Some of the things that, talking with the industry, what we notice is first, we need to have, for clear communication, we need to have a clear benchmark. Our benchmark is the business as usual. Our business as usual is using all of the current policy in every state, the state level energy and emission policy, state specific clean electric gas, etc., etc. And then we are developing those net zero emission pathways. We are including stakeholder feedback. Some of the stakeholder feedback, because we interact with the electricity sectors, their feedbacks are often on the technology. So we do have net zero pathways that are with CCS and some that are without CCS, so carbon capture. And then we do have a diversity of net zero emission pathway with a number of other assumptions that are across different sectors. So that's, I think the clear point here is that one, there are multiple ways to achieve a decarbonization of the whole economy, not just one. And it's important to have a number of them and to communicate them clearly. We also include the impact of climate change on those net zero emission, of course. Let's see. To get to those net zero emission of the whole economy, we're using the PNNL flagship model called GCAM for Global Change Analysis Model. GCAM links the economics, energy, land use, water, and climate systems. It's an open source model that you can find on GitHub right now with a number of annual workshops to be trained. So that's the part of accelerated progress. GCAM represents the entire world. In this initiative, we're using GCAM USA, which has a state scale representation. And coming back to some of the comments earlier, GCAM has been used worldwide on a number of initiatives to exactly have that interactions between the different sectors, addressing questions such as how change in populations, income, or technology costs might alter crop productions, energy demand, and water withdrawals. This type of questions are typically used on a number worldwide through a number through DOE and other international agencies. I think I'm not saying this enough. Net zero is a game changer, and we need to have this approach even just within the US as well. We need to rethink some of those interactions. So it's very, very important to use a model that help us have net zero emission pathways that allow us to understand the timing in the co-evolutions of the different sectors. So that's why we're using this model. Now, how it works for the rest of our pillars. For all of those emission scenarios, the global multi-sectoral approach is being analyzed and put into a report by an upcoming paper by Wu Yang et al. But from the electricity sector, here, this is an example of a projections. You have our benchmarks. We're focusing on the Western US on this one. So you have, for the business as usual, you have the electricity capacity by fuel for business as usual, and then one of our net zero emissions without CCS. Two things needs to happen for net zero. The first one, as you see, is that by 2035, we need to have a drastic change in generation portfolio. If you change the net zero emission and you have changes in technology, you're going to have variations in the colors on the right after 2035 with more gas CCS or less gas CCS last here because we didn't want any CCS in this one. The second thing that needs to happen is something that starts really diverging from the business as usual from after 2035 is the whole capacity number. It's an exponential increase. And what we found is that throughout our net zero scenarios, we do have some variations between our net zero scenarios, but that exponential increase is there every time. There is more differences between our between business as usual and net zero than within the net zero. So that's really important because then it's how we get there. So that's just providing a little bit on how we're going to the net zero emissions. Now, how do we provide resilience and reliability? Here, we're focusing on the power grid operations and environmental intelligence with climate stress tests, energy droughts, and transportation. Oops, sorry, it's a little animation that I was not expecting. Right. Okay, it's going to look like that. Just for this slide, let me go ahead with just this slide. As we go from long-term planning to reliability and resilience, the main point of this graph is to show that there is a big change in scale. All that I was talking about right now for the net zero emissions, we were talking at that scale here on the planning expansion, on the capacity expansion. This is the scale of resource adequacy. Everything is done at an annual time scale. So we can't really do reliability and resilience to the climate change at that scale. To get to the reliability and resilience, we need to go to different scales using different model. We're talking about the operations with a full unit commitment and economic dispatch. From a scale perspective, it means that we're going here on the right from planning and goals on the generation portfolio by step for different infrastructure year. But we need to then go to that operational scales, which goes at the scale of the different generators, and we go to an hourly time scale. So at that scale, not anymore, we need to have a higher resolution data sets and approaches. And let me walk you through how we're defining those grid stress. First, we're relying on that storyline climate simulations for the US. What is very specific about these climate data sets is that we have an historical data period from 1980 to 2019. And we are then doing a future climate that has the same sequencing, which allow us to evaluate how past events would replay under future climate. If there are some climate scientists in the audience today, some people like to say it's a delta approach, but it's a novel delta approach where it's not as if a heat wave from 2020, what if it was 1 or 2 degrees higher, and we'll say it's 2035. It's not being more complex, and you have a bit more definition of what a heat wave from the past is going to look like in the future. So this is really some of the basis for all of our climate resilience in that study. Now, what is resilience? We're using environmental intelligence in 2 ways. First, there is climate stress, and then there are energy droughts. What climate stress is when you evaluate, when you take an event from the past, the storyline approach, and yet you're going to derive the wind and solar and the load and the hydro, and you put it onto the power grid model, and then you evaluate all of the key performance metrics, loss of load, etc. That allows you to see if it passed the test. It's also a classification of extreme events. So it's very top-down. Another way to look at the environmental intelligence is to use all of to develop wind and solar and hydro and load data sets. And then you're going to go through all of those data sets. But because you know how the grid works, you're going to look for what is an energy drought. You're going to look at all of the spatial and temporal scales that matters. And every time that there's going to be an imbalance between the variations in the load and the variations in the renewable supply. And we use this climate physics to design infrastructure and operations. So I'm going to go through both of them to provide you an example on how that works. So first one for climate stress. Here we're looking at one particular balancing authority. We do it at the system scale, but we can also do it at the balancing authority. It helps address different questions on the transmission congestions or the load in general. And so here we are using at one balancing authority. We've been looking at the top extreme temperature between 1980 to 2019. In red, this is for the heat waves, and the bottom in blue, this is for the cold snaps. So very, very low temperature. And what we're trying to work on with the industry is understanding when you do a climate stress, where should it be? How long should it be? So here, that type of information help us work with the industry on how long this climate stress should be. And we're finding that those typical heat waves are about 6 to 7 days long on average, and generally pretty symmetric on about the maximum and minimum temperature day. So that type of analysis allow us to select dates that our stakeholders can use to do their stress test. There is a difference between temperature and load. So that's something that we're also working on with the industry. So here we're looking at the Western US, and this is the observed load from the last 40 years. And based on this, typically when we work with our stakeholders, and we say, let's have a climate stress, let's use a most recent heat waves or cold snaps. And of course, if you look at the load, you're going to find that they all happen in the last 5 years. And there is a reason for this because of the change in load and the change in infrastructure. But what happens is that when you use our simulations, and we have a model that I'm going to present after on how we go from temperature to load, we use this normalization, you can find that there are actually some past date that would be more impactful on today's climate than the one in the last recent 5 years. And that's the case for the heat waves in 2006, in 2010, and we have one in 1993 as well. And for the cold snaps, it turns out that if some of the event in the early 80s happened today, it would be worse than the one that we've seen over the last 5 years. So that's a bit how we work with on defining those climate stress tests with the industry. For the sake of time, I'm going to go forward with the droughts, energy droughts. So we've been developing wind and solar data set and hydro and load, and we are looking at some of the energy droughts. Actually, here is just wind and solar combined. And we've been looking at, with today infrastructure, so all the 2020 plants, we're looking for how long is a drought, a combined drought. And this is the number of droughts that we see for different balancing authority. For drought, that would be up to 4 hours long or 4 to 8, and it needs to be consecutive hours. And what we're finding is that typically, so those droughts, they don't last more than 16 hours. Where it's important to have those numbers is one, when you look at how batteries are used today and they are being dispatched on the daily timescale, we do know that they are being dispatched and typically their state of charge varies between 40 and 60%. What if we had a battery we know can recharge in 8 hours? Based on this intelligence, you know that you can have new goals on designing batteries that, you know, if we keep dispatching at a daily timescale, and we want to use the batteries more efficiently, then they need to recharge in 8 hours. So that's one of the conclusions. We also found that, you know, when do those happen? So we've been looking at those energy droughts, and typically they happen more in winter time. So that allows us to have some preparedness here in other technologies. Some of the next step here is that it's about long-term storage. We know that there is some emphasis on long-term storage, 5-8 days to more than 20 days. So this is, we're going to change our analytics to go and get that sub-seasonal timescale, which is coming next. So that was the climate stress test, and that was the approach to energy droughts and how it informs designing batteries and also how to operate them. We're also working at transport. The reason we look at transport, here you have on the graph, this is the projections from GCAM from our net zero emissions for the different years. And in blue, this is the load that is associated with light duty vehicle. And red is medium and yellow is high duty, and purple is non-road. What we see is that between those two different scenarios, there is a gradual increase throughout 2050 on the electrification of transport. The difference between net zero and business as usual is a lot that has to do with non-road. So that, you know, this needs to be our approach, whether this is going to be hydrogen or some other approaches. The point here is really to say that most load forecast model forecast at a daily timescale, but the hourly piece you keep the hourly profile, and then you rescale it based on climate. So it's very important that we understand if the charging from transport is how this is sensitive to climate, because then it will adjust, it will really impact this hourly profile. And this hourly profile is key for batteries and for grid stress. So we are developing a spatial and temporal downscaling approach for the load coming from GCAM to understand with the different behaviors when it's going to be charging and discharging. And we're also looking at the sensitivity to temperature. So this is one of those examples here where you have, it's for in red, this is the temperature at Maricopa in Arizona. And we are looking at the transportation load in that county this is for year 2035. And what we are seeing is that especially during summertime, when there is a peak in temperature, it's also when there is a peak in charging. So what we're finding here is that the electrification of transport impacts the hourly load profile. The summer temperature is impacting that charging, discharging, and the peaking. And that electrification of transport overall will increase the summer peaking native load of the system when other loads are also peaking. So this is something that we are addressing in our scenarios, and reliability and resilience is we're making sure that even our hourly load profile is considered when we're doing some climate stress tests and energy drought. I'm doing fine. Okay. Let me go through a little bit how the sauce is made, I want to say. The accelerated progress is something that you're going to find on our website and all of our reports in what we call resource and guidance. It's really our commitment to make sure that all the studies we have explicit workflows, tools, and data sets for people to use, and how we can engage all of the stakeholders at large on using those data sets so that they can do their own assessments, and that we can all move forward consistently toward net zero and all of the national goals. So of course, I'll come back to that, one. So we are back to that scale here. So far, we've been talking again about those GCAM scenarios, net zero emissions, and what was the planning. We also talked about how to do climate stress and energy droughts, and understanding the impact on climate on the hourly load profile. These are impacting the hourly load here. What I haven't talked about yet is how we go, like really with tools and data sets, how we go from planning to the operational model, how this is being done. And this is something that we want to make sure that people can follow, because it's extremely complex. And we found that working with the industry and the academy, not everybody is doing the entire process, but it needs to be clear how it's being done. So we're developing workflows. What the workflows are, it's an open book. It's an explicit documentation with non-proprietary data sets that are available at intermediate time step. So for example, so the nomenclature is that in blue, those are all of the models. All of the models that are non-proprietary are also going to be available for download. In green is all the data sets, and interface is when there is another workflow that is hidden in it. And we have, starting from, for example, the GCAM scenarios, this is something that we work with stakeholders, and whether we have CCS or no CCS and so on. They're then being processed through GCAM USA, and the output of the models are the GCAM database and all of the planning that you were seeing on the graph below, on the graph earlier. All of those databases are being made available. So if you are, say, a state legislator, or you want to have access to those data sets, then you know where to look for it, and you know how it was done. From the GCAM all the way to grid view, there's an entire process of citing the generators at each infrastructure year, and then developing the load, the wind, the solar, the hydro data sets. I'm going to go through it. But here, that was just the point was to really familiarize all of the everybody on what the workflow is, and how you can get to to the different steps, the different assumptions. And so you know when the data set is the right data set for you, or if you want to have a step earlier, and then rerun it with your own assumptions. So this is how you go from decarbonization pathways, then you have a transition to operational resilience, and then you can test the resilience. Some people will just want to get directly the grid view database. And the grid view database is proprietary. If you have a non-disclosure agreement or you have a grid view license, then we'll just provide it as is, and then you can do your own grid view runs. It's not just workflow, it's a documentation that goes with it. So what you're going to find is also all of these documentations on all of the code and how it's being run. So that's presently state of the art for every modeler. And let me go back a bit more to the siting, which is one of the key aspects of the on how we go from planning to operations. We start from those GCAM USA planning at the state scale. We have a generation portfolio for each infrastructure year, and it runs on every 5 years. So on the 5 years, that's what you see at the bottom here, we're using an iterative process where all of the infrastructure, the capacity is being downscaled to a balancing authority, and further then into all of the different nodes. And we have about 15,000 nodes within GridView. So all of the generators are being mapped to different polygons. And it seems easy, but you can't really map it without more information about the impact on the grid. That's why we have this iterative process. We start with the first understanding of what are the LMPs, the local marginal price for each of those polygons, and that's why you have a first siting. Once you will have this first siting, we are developing the wind, the solar, the load for each of the node, and we're going to run GridView to understand what's the impact on the reliability, grid stress test, but also on the economics. So that then we go back on the siting and adjust as needed to make sure that all of the siting is what makes the most sense from an economics, but also from all of the key performance metrics. This iterative process here is pretty heavy, but what it does is that it reduces the stranded assets when siting power plants. Stranded assets is really one of the major concerns from the industry. We want to make sure to understand how long it's going to be sustainable from an economic perspective and what will be the impact on the grid. So this is what, again, this is also one of the feedback from the grid, is making sure that we don't have any stranded assets and understand how much it really promotes investment. The other part that I want to go through is the siting of the new generation. Okay, I went through, so that was the process, but how it works from a workflow perspective. It goes, you have this iterative process, but what's going to happen here is here is everything that is available to stakeholders, and people just can access it from our website. The output from the siting model is that database of generators, sited generators, and all of their retirements and the O&M cost. This is production cost model agnostic at this time. There is then another process that is going to map it to the GridView database. That mapping approach, it can be leveraged. Say you're not a GridView user, you want to use Plexus, you want to use your own model, then you can use part of this code to make it available to any production cost model of your choice. And then you have the GridView database. This is, as I was mentioning, this is a proprietary data set. So they're going to be available, but it requires that you have a GridView license for those. So this is how we perceive, and this is really our commitment to have accelerated progress toward net zero. We have wind and solar generation. We are leveraging a number of NREL models, but the TGW data is our climate data set that I presented earlier. We also have the plant locations that are coming from our siting models. You could use your own plant location if you desire. but say you're using our workflows and you're using our infrastructure for all of the different 5 years. Then here we're providing the scripts to go all the way down to the hourly time series at each of the locations. I will have to say that we develop this wind and solar generation data set specifically to run the power system model. And so all of our evaluation at this time is really targeted toward a balancing authority. We're focusing grid stress. This is one way that we are differentiating a little bit from other data sets. It's not necessarily here for individual investors at one specific location. We're focusing on the grid. We've been mentioning to the forecast, the load forecast model. So we are using the total electricity load model, the TEL model. It projects the evolution of hourly electricity demand in response to changes in weather and climate. Because of this, this is why it's also important to have the transportation, and in the future we'll also have other sectors and their sensitivity to climate. It's based on a series of machine learning models trained on historical loads and meteorology. And what it does, it match GCAM, it match our net zero emissions. So we have really a consistency between our all net zero emissions and changes in the economy and the change in the load. The output is hourly projections of electricity demand. We have it at the county scale, and then we can rescale to the balancing authority scales, and then we have our mapping to the different nodes for production cost model. With this, I'd like to bring it to the conclusions of what's happening in GODEEEP. Is really understanding that the decarbonization pathways are really a game changers in system coevolution. It's important to understand the timing in that coevolution. So multi-sectoral approaches to emission pathways provide that confidence in investment and overall adoptions and communications with different sectors. What needs to happen first, what will be happen on the load, and that is going to propagate to confidence and reducing stranded assets. The data sets and the tools are made available for stakeholders to make their own assessments and making sure that, if some pieces adopt net zero and some others don't, we know that it will provide more uncertainties. So we really want to make sure that all of this progress is shared so that people can do their own assessment. The climate stress test ensure the climate resilience. We're also using the resource droughts to help design infrastructure and operations. And what I haven't talked about before, but please stay tuned, is then all of this evaluation on the environmental and social equity that supports the adoptions and the intended consequences of the decarbonization. And with this, I'd like to really thank you all for your attention and get your question.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much for that. We have a couple questions in the chat, so I thought I would go to those first. The first one is on slide 10. That hydros seem to be negligible in the WEC. Is that really the case, or is this a GCAM artifact that is not, where it is not output but is included?
A hydro capacity is pretty substantial in the WEC. So that is a very good remark. There must be something in the colors right here. I will get back on that. Thank you.
Okay. And then on slide 22, how was the transportation temporal load modeled, and was managed charging included, or was it just charging on demand?
Can you repeat the question?
Sure. For this slide, how was the transportation temporal load modeled, and was it managed charging included, or is the model using just on-demand charging?
My understanding is that this is on-demand charging. This being said, this is a big team. And maybe I can follow through with my transportation expert on this one, on this type of detail. You are absolutely right that there are a lot of assumptions on the transportation. That as part of this work, we are going through a number of assumptions. That is part of the uncertainty analysis. But we do not do what is it? It's not vehicle to grid. It's only grid to vehicle in that one.
Okay. So are there any questions here in the audience? How about any other questions on the audience online? So I have a little bit of a logistics question. You mentioned that there was a lot of different team members, and you yourself have a civil engineering background. Most of the folks in the room with me here are electrical engineering. So this is really a great example about how we're working from, we're no longer working in our silos, but so how do you as the team leader, how do you get the right people in place? And as we're talking about these students as they're graduating, how do they, what kind of things should they be doing to prepare them for being in this multi-dimensional team that's different areas, water, transportation, electricity, land use you talked about as well. So how do you, as organizing with this group, how do you do that? And what are some advice you might give to our students related to the multi areas that we're seeing where the biggest challenges are today?
A great question. And let me share maybe the experience where I think from a leader perspective, I think it's very important that at a high level we communicate the big picture and all of the different linkages between the disciplines. Some of the keys between all of the different projects is really understanding the finesses and the nuances between how one project do a certain linkages and another one do another linkages. So we constantly work on the communication to understand, why this project, a lot of people do decarbonizations. There are multiple ways to address it. The linkages between climate and the atmospheric models are being done a different way. So the way that we've been achieving this, I would say that maybe here, not from a leader perspective, but more from a student perspective and how to grow into this area. We're all very technical. We started with really understanding, we know our stuff. We all know our stuff. It's important that to be pretty passionate about what are the new innovation. And then it's about discussing with your peers. At first, you don't understand what they're talking about. You don't understand, you're not necessarily on the same page. You're not on the same scale. What you thought was super important to you, when you see it from the other perspective, it becomes small. So talking and really listening and understanding where we meet our objective, where we meet our disciplines has been pretty key. But that remains, having that curiosity of really, this is how things work, but from your perspective, from your eyes, from your discipline, what do you see? And you take it as part of joining those big projects. It's also a question of opportunities. I don't think that you can get there without, you can, but I think having the opportunity to join one of those large projects is really also an opportunity for a group growth. And everybody's growing from it. It's individual staff, but also the leadership.
I have a question here.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So I have two questions. One is when this GODEEEP will be available for us to explore. And the second one is while you are assessing the social impact of this climate changing scenarios, what are the matrices that you are considering for that?
The methods, you say?
I mean, what are the matrices that you are considering to assess the social impact of this climate change? Like, what are the measurement parameters that you are considering for social behavioral change or something like that?
Okay. So we are working on the GODEEEP website at this time. We're really trying to get a starter of all of the data sets so that we can get early feedback. Like you've seen all of those workflows, making sure that the format is something that is accessible. When we have some publication, we have large data sets that are out there, but we notice that then it's really the academics can access them, but not the industry. So all the feedback we can get early on the format of the data sets is going to be very valuable. So I can send to this group as soon as we're getting some of the data sets and opening up the website. And we would be tremendously grateful to get feedbacks on them. Kind of a user experience, give us feedback. But we're talking about the next, we're talking in terms of weeks, month, 2 months at most. With respect to the social inequity aspect, it is very broad. And it goes from understanding the impact on the revenues to understanding the changes in greenhouse gas emissions locally and where it overlays with underrepresented communities, for example. So we are approaching it from a number of different angles. And when Stephanie Wolof, who is also leading this part, can talk more, but she can talk for a good hour on it.
So I want to touch base a little bit related to policy. You mentioned we're looking at a worldwide view on this because it affects all of us as we talk about climate change. As we look at the U.S., we have, and even I'll just take an example of Washington and Idaho right next to each other. We see very different goals around net zero and around climate change across the country. So how, and I know you're doing the technical side, but how do you see policy and because we don't have a one size fits, I mean, we do have federal initiatives, but we have such varying initiatives statewide. How do you see that as a challenge for the technical side of what you're trying to do as you look at the GODEEEP goals?
Thanks for asking this. And you're absolutely right that some of my colleagues it would be good to have a further discussion. But this is where the GCAM model comes pretty handy, because when we are doing those net zero emissions, because this is at the state scale, it's using it, even if we're developing those net zero emission, we are starting from the current policy, and we know that there are certain moratoria that are not going to change. And so this is why it's being done at the state scale, is actually to have that privilege communications with the state policy. So you're absolutely right. We were talking about interdisciplinarity earlier. The scale of the decision making is absolutely key. So the net zero at the net zero, because it's the whole economy and you have all of those state mandates, it's at the state scales with also a lot of federal and international relationship. When it comes to more engineering and reliability, you've noticed that we have all of those scenarios for the entire US, but now we're starting focusing on these different interconnections, and then we're going to the balancing authority. And when it comes to social and environmental impact, for social, we are at the county scale and the census scale. And when we're on the environmental scale, now we are looking at watersheds, for example. Those are all very important scale that, throughout the entire team, we keep discussing about what are the scales that matter.
Yeah, so it would seem like that you had that graph of the operations versus planning. You've also got scales related to state, it sounded like county, state, federal, countries. So there are lots of different aspects. So I think, you know, one of the things, as you mentioned, the assumptions are really important, that you're having to say what ifs and some of that. And particularly for our students, that becomes important in their research is what are their assumptions and writing those down and some of that. So any questions online? Does anyone want to unmute and ask a question?
I'll ask a quick one. This is Jeff Daigle. Thanks, Nathalie, for great presentation. Really enjoyed it. So what's the next steps when you get all these pieces and parts put together? You know, where do we go? You know, maybe the year after this project is over, and 2 years after this project is over. What's your vision for how we're going to change the world? To just kind of help paint a long-term perspective here.
Thank you for asking. So some of the vision at this time is we already working with stakeholders on getting feedbacks on the net zero emission. So on this net zero emission pathway. So we already have some feedbacks on when we think the technology is going to be adopted or not. So we're providing those net zero emission pathways and trying to warm up the stakeholders on what are the different scenarios. And they are the questions that they are currently asking. And we are working with them on what are the questions also that they should ask. And so that provides, just from a communication perspective, is making sure that they're also aware of the state of the art that is becoming available. So that is just from a stakeholder engagement perspective. Like you've seen, a lot of our engagement is also going through the workflows and the data sets. So we have a number of engagements with sponsors, and we're trying to get more also with the industry. We're going to have a series of workshops over the next couple of months to show what are the data sets, how they can be used, what are the research questions that they can be addressed. And we have a number of end use cases saying, you know, this is what we did over the Western US. You can do it over, say, a specific balancing authority, or what we would like to is being able to extend over the entire US. There are some very nice nuances and stories that are different challenges that are different over the Western US, ERCOT, and Eastern US. So looking for here, that would be more on the DOE sponsors. There's a number of initiatives like the National Transmission Planning that we can work with. That would be NORM also. I think we have a number of grid stress and our drought stress, our drought studies that can also inform from a manufacturer perspective how to design storage, finding some nuances of the charging and the discharging time that matters, understanding local storage versus transmission, where it makes sense from an equity perspective, and then also from a resilience perspective. So we have more research questions than answer at this time. It's really a matter of getting the word out.
Thanks, Jeff. So I think that you probably have a lot of people interested about those workshops and data sets and those kind of opportunities. So Nathalie, thank you so much for presenting and for a great overview of a very, very complex topic. But I thought your examples were really great and helped us understand better. So we look forward to the website being up and those workshops as they're available for academics. I'm sure we will share it with our students as they'll be interested in this as they're looking at their next opportunities beyond their, but as well as some of their PhD work. But, you know, I think one of the great things that I started with is how everything is all related. And we think a lot of times about the power grid and just what's happening with the power grid. And now we're talking about water, we're talking about the environment, we're talking about social economics. Looking at storage, we've talked a lot about storage related to short term. And I've always said the holy grail is for us to get long-term storage. But I've been saying that for 25 years, so you're all challenged to try to figure that out. But yes, we really appreciate your time and the presentation, and look forward to the next steps with GODEEEP. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, everybody, for being here. And we'll have our next ESIC seminar next week at 11 a.m. Pacific. And for those of you that are interested, we do have a faculty candidate interview this afternoon at 1:30 presentation. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.